Hello gamers, Power Heal here, and welcome to the Classic Plus Corner. This is a segment of the channel where we discuss all things related to WoW Classic Plus. Today will be episode 19, and we will be talking about raid sizes. So how many people do you want in your raid in WoW Classic Plus? And before we really get into this, I do want to let everyone know that, I pretty much am coming at this from the perspective of a healer. That's what I mostly play in WoW Classic. I have played DPS, both in retail. In fact, in retail, I main DPS, and in Classic, I primarily play healer. Just wanted to kind of put that out there because it does sort of change your perspective a little bit sometimes on, do you care about this a lot? Do you care about it a little? Do you care about it at all? Right? So just wanted to be forthcoming. Now, let's start with 40 mans first of all, and we'll kind of work our way to some of the other ideas that have been tossed around. So I kind of have a special place in my heart for 40 mans, and we'll get into the criticism of them because there's lots the community always brings up. But I have to admit that there's something nostalgic and in the best way about doing 40-man raids, just seeing that crowd of players. It's not the same when you have 20. I've done quite a bit of raiding. In fact, if you combine my total WoW time, most of it has been spent in retail in some form or another, like the initial kind of go through of the game. And, they changed the raid size to 25 immediately in TPC, so 40 mans are gone pretty much from the get-go. So I've been playing most of my time playing the game up until recently at least, but if we count total time, still the vast majority of my time playing the game in 25 or 20 man modes. And 25 man and 20 man, in my opinion, are virtually indistinguishable in terms of the feel. It's not really that much different from the perspective, I would say, of your average player, right? If we're trying to talk about, raid for world first compositions and, how it feels to do a raid with a certain amount of healers versus other amount of healers, we can get into the minutia there and things might feel a little bit different. But for the vast majority of people playing, I don't think there's a huge difference between 20 and 25 people. I think that's actually why they ended up going to 20, because they realized it wouldn't feel that much different for the average player, and it's more just about, well, it's easier to coordinate having 20 people, right? I think that a lot of this kind of came from pressure from other games. Like I know Final Fantasy 14, I think, what is the highest size? Like a lot of the stuff is done in like 8 or 10 player content, like 20 is like the highest, or is it 18 or something? It's very kind of low with respect to obviously the initial 40, and then even the the 20 that came after that. So I think they tried to adapt over time. A lot of people did enjoy the change because there's a lot of problems with 40 man, but I don't really get that sense that I do when I walk into Molten Core and there's like, literally 39 other players around me. It does feel a bit grander. There's something about that you can't quite replicate. Now, I'm not somebody who's necessarily a slave to these sorts of feelings. So just because there is something novel and unique about it doesn't necessarily mean it's worth preserving over other things, right? So I want to start this off that you're probably hearing this, you're like, oh my god, this guy's so nostalgic about 40 man, it's so cringe, like I want 25 man rating. I'm not writing it off, okay? And there's ways that, have already been done that we'll talk about later that can kind of incorporate both of these into the equation. But we're going to stick on 40 men just for a moment here. Yeah, I just really love that epic feeling of seeing so many players. Also, and this is something that could be kind of balanced more, but I feel like it just doesn't get balanced. But I feel like part of the loot scarcity in the original Classic WoW comes from the fact that you have so many players in the raid. And we'll talk about flex raiding a little bit later on in the video, but I almost feel like 40 man is sort of the original flex rating, because you can't tell me that the devs looked at something like Molten Core or doing like the math down to the final point of damage and like, oh man, yeah, we mapped this out so that they absolutely needed 40 people to down Golemag, or they absolutely needed it to take out Rag. Even back in the day when we were worse, I think that still you could clear a lot of this content, being either 5 or 10 players down outright, or even just like 5 or 10 players that have no idea what's going on. It's kind of always been the case. It's always been the joke. Even before we've kind of gone back to 2019 Classic, people were saying that leading up to 2019 Classic. The raids aren't going to be like that hard. You just need kind of a core of people that knows what's going on. I think that's pretty true. And so in some ways they're like the original flex, right? Where you could have done this stuff with less people, but you sort of did choose to bring 40, and just to make things easier, to make everything go smoother. And I think it did add something. There was some sort of charm. It had that epic feeling, and it's kind of fun, in my opinion, to. I've been on both sides of this, right? I've been on just the player side. I've been on the side of people who have kind of managed everyone as well. That can get a bit tedious at times, I'll admit, right? But there's something about interacting with like 40 different players in your guild, and it's funny because a criticism that I often hear when talking about 40 is like, oh, you don't even know half these people in our guild. And maybe for some people that's true, I'm not sure, but going back to my original memories of, classic WoW in like 2005, 2006, and also in 2019, I really did know most of the players in my guild. Now, obviously, cliques sort of form here and there. You might know some better than others, but I was on a first name basis with pretty much all of these people. I could I swear I could go and I could get like at least 25 to 30 people out of this roster. And most of that is not even because I couldn't name the whole 40-point roster, but it's more just about the fact that, sometimes the rosters change, they're in flux. So it's like, which roster are you talking about? And it's funny, even players that I distinctly right now don't really remember their actual character name, I remember stuff about their personality. I can visualize the player in my head, but I just don't really recall the exact character name. So I don't know. A lot of these people have definitely had an impact on me, and I have definitely remembered them even from 2019 Classic. Maybe I just have a good memory. I think I've always had a photographic memory. I don't know if that has something to do with this. It seems a little bit different because we're not really talking about photographs. That's maybe where the remembering of the players comes without knowing the name. I'm not entirely sure, but I don't know. I've always felt that you can connect with that many players. And I think at least the claims that it's impossible are highly over exaggerated, because I feel like I've done it. Does it happen for everyone? Maybe not. But it happened for me, and I quite enjoyed having this big pack of people to kind of manage and help guide through things, even though sometimes it could be a bit much. And that's the thing we're going to talk about next, is kind of why did 40-man disappear to begin with? Well, I think it's a couple things, right? The roster boss is the thing that's most commonly cited. Everybody's kind of experienced this, where it can be difficult to kind of get people up for raids sometimes after the raid's been out for so long and stuff like that. Usually at the beginning, people are clamoring for a spot. You basically couldn't fill the raid enough, right? But by the end, it's a bit different, and there's just way too many people that are kind of calling out or missing here or there. It creates frustrations. When you have a huge roster you need to fill, it kind of exacerbates those issues, right? So there's that, and then there's also just the logistics and the managerial stuff, right? So if you do DKP system, it's obviously harder to track 40 players than 20 or 25. If you're doing loot council, harder to track 40 players than 25, and it doesn't just go into these things, it goes into everything else about the guild. If you're trying to stay on top of them for things like even the AQ war effort, or if you have certain incentives about things like getting your Earth Strike or something like that, it's just harder to manage all these people. So I totally get the idea of just simplifying things down, going to a smaller number, keep things more manageable, help the roster boss situation a little bit. I think that's the main reason why people often give for why they want to retreat from this kind of 40-man cluster F that we see in WoW Classic. So I totally understand that, and there's been a couple of solutions that have been offered by Blizzard. So obviously there's some people who just want to go to 20 or 25-man rating, right? That's where they think it's best. But there's also been other solutions regarding flex, and I want to talk a bit about those because I find them interesting. There's two different types of flex, and I prefer one over the other, but I'll kind of explain them both right off the bat so there's no confusion, because there can be, I find that if somebody hasn't played any of Seasons of Discovery and you talk about flex, they have a very specific idea of what you mean by flex, and it's not actually accurate to what people are proposing and suggesting in some cases. So how flex works in kind of modern retail is that you can choose the amount of people you go into raid with on the non-maximum difficulty. Now, in Classic Plus, the idea would be people are asking for flex for the one difficulty. So they're not asking for multiple difficulties, at least for the most part, from my understanding, like they are in retail. They're asking for one difficulty, but you can flex the amount of people you bring in. And the idea is that, you scale the health and the damage and the healing in some cases, although the healing is a little bit weird because you can't necessarily make the mobs do way more damage even if you have more players, right? Because it would one-shot people and stuff like that. But the general gist is you would scale the amount of DPS needed based on the amount of players, okay? So if you go into, I think in retail, you can have up to like 30 people in a heroic split, and the minimum is like, is it 10 or 15 or something like that? I haven't played in a bit, but it's something like that where you can have a wide variety of players. And not only does the boss HP scale, but the loot scales as well. So, if you're getting like, I don't know how many pieces of loot you'd get at 30, you get maybe 6 or 8. And if you had like 15, you would maybe get 3 or 4 or something like that. I'm not entirely sure. Again, just making numbers up off the top of my head. But that's the gist of it, is that the loot scales as well as the number scale. And then sometimes mechanics will scale as well. Like maybe, you'll get more ads proportional to a certain number of players. I'm not entirely too sure on that, but I could see that being a thing. So that's basically the idea of the modern retail scaling. And this is kind of just a way to allow casual players to sort of play together, right? And not really, they're not really super concerned about the end game of like the sanctity of it, right? Because it's not the highest difficulty. And I think this already brings up a point of contention that some people have with scaling in WoW Classic, because a lot of people want the game to have a certain level of prestige or something like that. And it gets kind of weird when you add the scaling factor in, because theoretically, yeah, it should scale equally at every point. But in a lot of cases, it's just easier to do fights in some cases with more people or less people. For example, just to kind of go back into the day, there was this period of time in WoW where 10-man and 25-man actually gained the same loot on the highest difficulty, which I believe at the time was Heroic. This is before Mythic actually was introduced. And so you could do Heroic 10-man and get the same loot as 25. And there was a lot of debate about which one was harder. I think by and large, 25-man was usually harder because it was just more difficult to coordinate 25 people. And a lot of the mechanics involved spacing, and the rooms were similar size. So anything where you had to like do a spread out mechanic or something like that, there was a lot more, fighting for space in the 25-man runs, right? So if you tried to do this kind of scaling thing, inevitably there would be some form factors for certain encounters that would be easier than others. And some people might dislike that, and, they think it would ruin the authenticity of the raid, perhaps. I personally wouldn't really care that much, and I don't think that that's too big of a concern, but just something to kind of throw out there that I know some people will reference, right? Now, the other form of this kind of like scaling is a bit different, where instead of scaling the actual numbers on the boss, you purely scale the amount of players. So the idea is that this is kind of also a lever for difficulty. So let's say you have a fight and you're really struggling on it to hit the DPS check or something like that. It's designed for 25 players, but the check is maybe a little bit tight. It's like tighter than WoW Patchwork equivalent, okay? And you're just not able to hit it. So instead, you bring in 5 extra players. You have 30 players now. But the boss health doesn't go up. No additional ads spawn. No new mechanics sprout up or anything like that. You purely have 5 players of extra power now. On the surface, this is like crazy. It's like, okay, well, you're just trivializing things, right? And I think that's the main concern with this sort of approach. But in spirit, it has an interesting idea. And they did this to Season of Discovery, and a lot of people seem to like it. And the gist is that the player can kind of adjust their own difficulty, and there's a built-in reward in the sense that if you do it with the appropriate number of players, the players it was designed for, 25 players, you get more loot, because you don't get extra loot like you do in the retail scaling. They keep the loot the same, and you can add more players, but you're getting punished because now you have to dole that loot out to a wider variety of players. And I actually think this is a pretty elegant solution to a lot of the problems that I think people foresee in WoW Classic. And in particular, there's been this hot question that we talked about just moments ago of, are they going to bring multiple difficulties to WoW Classic? Should they bring multiple difficulties? And maybe we'll do a separate video on that entirely. But I think that this solution kind of works to answer that problem, right? Because I think that one thing that people have not enjoyed about retail, the classic crowd, is how many versions of things there are. And inevitably, when you create multiple versions, it tends to create more chores for players, and we see this with, the race for world first players, how they're doing heroic as well as mythic, and then you're kind of just going into the same raid and doing the same thing again, except it's kind of like the real version of mythic, which makes the heroic version a bit weird. It also now creates this sort of toxicity between players, right? Because if you're just a heroic raider, then, you didn't even do the same mechanics as the mythic raiders. So there's a bit of an elitism element there that's almost inescapable. Some people don't mind that. They're very content to just do heroic raiding, but other people, it's like maybe they're doing heroic raiding with their friends because that's their friend's skill level, but they don't like the fact that they've never really been able to do the real fight, quote unquote, because it doesn't even have the same mechanics. So you kind of run into all these awkward problems, and I understand why Blizzard initially put the additional difficulties in the game, but it does kind of drag up these issues that we're talking about right now. So this scalable raid size thing, I think, actually is a great solution because all of the players that are sort of like hardcore are just going to do the raid as normal at the intended difficulty, okay? And you're not really changing the fight, so it's not like you don't get to see Heroic Lich King, or you don't get to see Heroic Archimon, or you don't get to see the mythic version of Tindral or something like that, these legendary really hard fights, right? You get the same version as everybody else, but you can augment the difficulty, and you can do it with a very fine-tooth comb, to be honest. You can literally add 5 more players, you can add 8, you can add up to 15. Now, maybe the exact number you add could change. Maybe the cap is not 40. Maybe you have 20-man raids and it can go up to 30, 35. They would have to obviously figure out the numbers there. I do think that, allowing people to bring an extra 15 people to an encounter that you were supposed to have 25 for, that might be a bit much. It might trivialize it in a certain sense, but again, now the loot is, it's diluted, right? So it's not like you're not being punished for it, which I find to be interesting. There's other things you could do to incentivize people for doing it at the normal difficulty, but some of them, I don't know if I'd really like. We could talk about them in different videos, but maybe you could have a thing where items get a chance to upgrade a very small amount, and it has a higher chance to occur in the 25-man raid. But to be honest, I don't really like doing stuff like that, and I think if I were to implement that sort of flex system that they did in SOD, I would keep it basically exactly like they did in SOD, and I would just have the punishment be that the loot pool is diluted a little bit, and keep it at that. And the other thing I'll say too is that bringing more players isn't always the best solution. And, you could easily imagine this. Just think like Raid for World First, okay? You have Echo and Limit, and they're going neck for neck on this boss. It's like super difficult, really high DPS check. And Limit gets the option to add an extra player. It's like a cheat code in the system, right? You can +1. And, of course, everybody's like, well, of course you would do it, right? You just add the extra player, you're down the boss easy. Well, yeah, if it's a limit player, maybe, or a player in the top 10, 25 guild, but what if you had to select a player from, like, a bottom of the barrel guild, like a normal raider that's never done Mythic before, and you had some kind of, like, instant wipe mechanics on this fight, or it doesn't even have to be instant wipe mechanics, but, just mechanics where one person can kind of make things a big problem, sort of like on Baron Geddon in classic terms, right? Would you bring that player? Powered heals phone. Would you bring that extra player now, right? And honestly, a guild like at that level, they couldn't afford to bring a player like that, right? Because this guy would just be wiping every pull, and it would be better off for them to just figure out how to squeeze the last bit of damage out organically. And similarly, although I think generally speaking, this flex would work as a difficulty adjuster to make things easier, there could be certain scenarios where, depending on the fight, it's not just going to be, oh, this fight's free if you drag an extra 15 people in, right? Because those 15 people are now all eligible new targets for the mechanic, and depending on how important the mechanic is to the fight, it could be quite devastating if you have players that have no idea what they're doing, messing up all these mechanics. So I don't think it's completely free, as people say, and personally, it wouldn't bother me to allow this. And I think it's a great flex thing. You can kind of like allow people to grow into their roster, right? So if they need to, like, you could have a guild that, maybe they have like a 20, 25 person core-ish, they're around that, and they're trying to establish themselves, and normally it's hard to establish yourself if you can't down bosses, right? But they could pug, and then once they kind of get the fight down, their own members get the reps in, they become better at the fight, they could stop pugging, they could add some of the pugs in to finish out the roster. Creates this cool organic environment, I think, where you could transition over from pugs to normal raids really easily. And then also, I think it helps kind of maintain a roster. Because in 2019 Classic, one of the main things that we had that was a big source of stress for the officers is obviously you need to kind of over-roster for your guild. Like, you can't have a 40-man raid and only have 40 people on the roster, right? That's just a recipe for disaster. So what we would do all the time is we would just sit people. Like, I would take a turn sitting, other people would take a turn sitting. Now, this wasn't the end of the world, and to be honest, most of us actually liked the idea of being the guy who was getting to sit, because when you get to sit, what that meant is you get to raid with another guild. And when you get to raid with another guild, you had chances to get items outside of, your loot system, basically, right? So if you weren't in line for Rejuvenation Gem, or if it was going to cost you big to get Rejuvenation Gem in your raid, if you go outside of your raid and you get it, that's a huge boon. So everybody kind of liked the idea. It's kind of like a gamble, right? You get to go to another raid once in a while and roll the dice. Maybe you get super lucky and you bring a really good item back home. Benefits you because you don't lose prio on stuff in the guild. Benefits the guild because now there's one less person that needs the big item. So this wasn't a terrible system that we had where we'd rotate players in and out. But the problem is that from the officer's perspective, it was just kind of a nightmare doing the roster every week and getting the logistics down. And then, there'd be some weeks where people would be up for items because we were using loot lists. And that was the main problem for us, is like when people felt up for an item, and this wouldn't only be in loot list, it'd be a thing in loot council as well, because in loot council, most of the time you have an idea where items are going before they actually drop, hopefully at least. So, you're trying to have this guy in your run, and you have multiple people like that, right? So you're trying to ensure they're all in the same run, they're all in the same splits or whatever, and it can just get a little bit annoying. And this would solve that problem, right? You can basically just bring everybody that's over the cap. Like if you had, let's say you're mostly a 25-man guild, right? That's kind of like your thing. You're trying to be a 25-man guild. But you have a roster of like, let's say 27, 28 people that are all really solid. Realistically, you could run most of your raids as 25 or 27, and then, for those weeks that maybe you want to do a speed run or something, there might be some things that are only 25-man enabled, right? So if somebody was doing speedrun tracking, I imagine they would set a limit for how many people you can have in the raid. So if you wanted to combine your efforts to do a speedrun, you could always do something like that, where you just, most of the time you're raiding 27, 28 people. Then for that week you want to do the speedrun, you take the 25 people that are interested or the best players, you do the speedrun, then you go back to farming like normal. And yeah, you'll be slightly less effective maybe because you're getting less gear every other run, right? Because your loot ratio in terms of the drops to players is a little bit worse. But by and large, you're not going to really brick your guild by bringing 28 people to a run. And I think for the most part, definitely for sort of like dad guilds and stuff like that, this is the approach they'd have. They wouldn't be freaking out about losing out on a little bit of loot efficiency to bring 2 or 3 valued members or friends in. And the great part is that if you lose those people, you're not below the number you're supposed to go in with still. So you always maintain this little bit of a buffer state, and it gives you time to actually recruit new players. It's not like, oh, we're recruiting players on raid night because we're down, right? We're at 20 players right now. It's like you're mostly hovering at that 27, 28. The times you do drop down to 25, you almost have advanced notice, right? You're still able to complete the raid just fine. It almost benefits you to have 25, and then you're re-recruiting to have a little bit of that extra buffer again. So I actually find that solution, I think, to be the most elegant. And if you look at the survey results, it seems that most people find that as well. I think I have them here, and yeah, it's reduce the raid size to 20 and allow me to bring more than 20 if I want to, like SOD. That's 39% of the population. Then there's 31% that want the retail system, which I'm actually a little bit surprised about. But I don't think it's that bad of a system. I don't think that would break the game. I just think that the SOD system is better, right? So I don't think that having the loot scaling and the actual boss scaling is terrible, but I don't think it's necessary as well. And the last point I kind of want to touch upon, which we already sort of did, but I want to highlight another aspect of it, is when we talk about making encounters easier and having that difficulty lever, the thing that I really like about doing it this way is it just feels so much more organic than kind of nerfing specific mechanics of the fight. And a great example of this would be, it's probably not good to use this, but there was this fight that was really hard. I think it was like the last expansion, or it was like a couple tiers ago. It was like Mythic Tindril for Race for World First, and it was like this mechanic with the seeds, and it's a lot to remember, but basically the gist of it, for you guys who didn't do this fight or you didn't watch it be done in Race for World First, is that the whole difficulty of this fight was managing the seeds on this fight. They were basically like what you would wipe to a majority of the time, especially towards the end. And Fire Act 2 had a very similar mechanic, actually. And these bosses were incredibly hard. I think the Tindril one was like 400 and something wipes. Fire Act was like 300 and something. But keep in mind, Fire Act, I believe, was like a longer fight. And also, there was a lot more time discussing things. So the wipe counter doesn't always tell the full tale. They were both incredibly hard fights for their own reasons. And when they nerf these fights to allow kind of like the more average players to be able to complete them, right? Because they don't want only Limit and Echo and like 10 other guilds being the ones who down these fights. A lot of times it's not simply a numbers nerf. If it was simply a numbers nerf, then that would function very similarly to what we're talking about here with the raid size adjustment, because that's essentially what you're doing, right? You're just bringing in a higher number of players to make the number requirement easier, whether it be damage or healing. But that's actually another good point too. I didn't really mention. It's not just DPS checks, but you can get through healing deficiencies by just adding more healers, right? If you have tanks dying, you can just add a specific healer on the tank by adding another player to the raid. If you have the raid dying, you can just add more raid healers. So another interesting way to balance things there. But yeah, basically, with this particular fight, how they, in most fights in retail, how they end up nerfing these things is they change the kind of like the core mechanics. And I think it just leaves a sour taste in the mouth of a lot of the players when they don't get there first, right? Because it's almost like they never really truly got to experience the fight and the challenge of dealing with the mechanic in its original form, because Blizzard kind of just decided at some point that, hey, that was kind of like too hard, And luckily, I think in Classic WoW, we're probably never going to get this thing. They're not going to design the game, to be played by Liquid and Echo. Right, so we're not going to run into this problem to begin with, but we're not even going to have a chance to run into it even on a more minor scale, right? If you do this scalable raid size thing, where I think the vast majority of the nerfs are easily going to be able to be handled by this, and you're not going to have to do these things where it's like, oh, you didn't down it by December 2026. Oh well. I guess you're a noob, you'll never get to experience the fight in its original form, because you're still having to do the mechanics, most likely, right? Unless they make something super overtuned and they personally just decide to walk it back. But this gives them a much better lever, and I think it's a much better way to kind of quote-unquote nerf things rather than fundamentally change the mechanics and, just leave that sour taste in everybody's mouth where it's like, oh, I never really got to experience the real fight. So I'm a super big fan of the scalable raid sizes. I'd be okay if they just left it at 40. I'll be honest, I'm a 40-man simp, kind of at my core, but I have a feeling that they're not. I think that the accessibility and just everything that they probably have telling them and informing them metrics-wise probably points to the fact of 20 or 25-man being better, at least at a base level. And it's realistically probably just easier for them to balance the raid around 20, 25 people than it is to balance around 40 people. So with that in mind, I think that they probably will go with the 25-man flex option, and if they do, I'm perfectly fine with that. I'll be really happy. I'll probably be able to get into both types of raids, right? I'm sure there'll be pugs who'll have, 30, 35 people running in them. There'll be guilds that'll have 25 people. Might even get to experience best of both worlds. I'll say as a healer, as much as I love the charm of 40 man, like I was talking about at the start of the video, the healing can be very sporadic. And once you get too many healers in the raid at 40 players, which I feel like you tend to overheal things once you get to that like 35, 40 player, it's almost just like a natural part of how the raid comp gets built out, because at that point, each individual DPS is not really adding a ton more to your total and your clear speed, right? And it just becomes about, well, might as well add another healer here because it just makes things safer. And like, yeah, we might down things a little bit faster with 1 or 2 extra DPS, but if we wipe once or twice, all that speed is gone, right? So people default to bring more healers, and that kind of makes healing things less fun, right? A lot of things are very overhealed in Classic. That's why there's so much sniping and there's kind of like so much competition for heals. And I feel like the healing will be, if you've never done 25-man healing before, it'll be fun for you, I think. It's a little bit more pressure on you, but that's good. Pressure can be fun sometimes. And I don't think it's not going to be like a retail environment where there's crazy pressure. So if you're worried about that, you shouldn't be. And yeah, I think it'll be more interactive. You'll kind of get to do more. Instead of having these maybe super rigid or defined roles, you'll be a bit more flexible. You'll be encouraged to be a bit more flexible. So yeah, I think I would really look forward to 25-man healing, and I'm curious to see what decision they're going to make, but like I said, I think they're going with the scaling. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Do you want to keep it 40-man? Do you want to just do 20-25? Or are you in favor of the SOD scaling changes? Or are you in favor of the retail scaling changes? Those aren't horrific either. I just think the SOD ones are superior. So yeah, if you like this type of content, like, comment, and subscribe. And I will talk to you guys next time. See ya.